All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Professor Barry here. And yeah, hope everything's going well. We started off the term kind of first week, just kind of getting into what is the sociological perspective? What are some of the ways in which we can apply that sociological perspective to the examination of deviance and criminality? Which got us into thinking about cultural values and ideals and social forces and the process of making meaning. What gets defined as being deviant, like how do we understand all this kind of this stuff, right? And this week we're kind of moving to thinking about the audience and think about sometimes we study deviance and we study like cultural ideas about deviance and criminality to understand what's going on with the audience, the community, individuals, institutions. For something to be deviant, there has to be a label attached to that particular behavior and idea. So sometimes there's the application of the labels coming from a group or individuals that's coming from something within society itself. So this week we're going to be focusing on the audience response, or how do we think about the banning of behavior. So yeah, it's going to impact like a lot of dynamics here, like defining and responding to deviance. So to get there, I think kind of important to differentiate between two different approaches to thinking about investigating human behavior, or just tools of science or approaches of science. Like how do we think about, what are some different philosophies about how do we understand the social world? And one approach is positivism, and the other one's constructionism. So I'll lay out the framework of both and what both these approaches, what the ideas are, and then we'll kind of talk about the value and benefits of both, and then the importance of seeing and recognizing both of them. So these are just different ways of approaching understanding deviance and crime. One's not right and one is not wrong. There's different ways of thinking about deviance and criminality, different approaches to thinking about deviance and criminality, and it'll make sense when we start to unpack the major ideas about these particular approaches. Notice that, that there's a difference between deviance and crime. Crime is things against the law, so it has to be like a criminal sanction, like there's a legal code that's been violated. Deviance doesn't necessarily involve a legal code. It's possible somebody commits a crime, let's say they jaywalk, but there's no deviance associated with that, or very little deviance associated with that. It's possible somebody could be engaged in deviant behavior, but it's actually not criminal. Somebody could get a full facial tattoo, and that may be viewed as deviant, but it's not a crime to do that, right? So we're separating out deviance and criminality. But sometimes when I'm presenting information, I try to be conscious and aware to say deviance or criminality or deviance or crime, but I don't always do that. It just takes a lot of words to do that all the time. So just sometimes for simplicity's sake, I make these terms interchangeable, even though they're not. Anyway, just kind of go, so when you hear me say deviance, or if I say criminality, just be thinking about both. All right, with that being said, so here's an overview of kind of what the positivist perspective is all about. So this perspective is focused on trying to understand the factors that influence people to commit an act of crime or an act of deviance. Individuals who commit violent crime, what are some variables, or what are some things that we can consider in looking at that may be indicators that a person is more likely to engage in violent behavior? So one way to think about this is like stuff related to criminology, more frequently applied to criminology, trying to understand crime patterns, try to understand the motivations or reasons why people commit crimes, or things that we call high consensus or high order crimes, like violent crime, would be more prone to this sort of positivist approach. One way, if it's helpful to think about if you are studying health and the distribution of health outcomes in a community, things like heart disease or diabetes. This is going to be the same logic and the same approach as studying crime, where you're investigating, okay, what are all the connections for heart disease? What's the rate of heart disease in different demographics based on age, based on gender, based on region of the country, based on geographic location? What are the contributing factors to heart disease? I mean, it's like looking at the variables of influence, like the independent variables influencing the dependent variable of heart disease. Similar logic that where it's the same logic, that's very positivist, same it's going to apply to deviance and criminality. Uh, Violent crime rates, who are the individuals who are more likely to be committing violent crime based on age, based on gender, based on region of the country, economic class. What are the contributing factors? What are the variables? This is sort of the logic of a positivist approach. We could go at the very micro level at the positivist approach and sort of understand that a positivist is looking for things that are verifiable, observable, measurable. It could be that one indicator for a person be more likely to commit violent crime is that they've experienced violence themselves. They've been a victim of violence. And we could measure that based on survey data, can measure that based on past criminal record, whatever it may be, but you can verify and observe sort of the phenomena. So the research in this area of positivists is sort of founded on an idea that you can distinguish between the deviant and the non-deviant, that there's certain things that are inherently different between the person who's deviant and the person who does not engage in deviance or criminal activity. Somebody who embezzles money from a corporation versus those who do not, high levels of embezzlement, that there's something different in terms of characteristics, background, history of individuals who engage in embezzlement versus those who do not. Not all individuals who engage in embezzlement may share all those characteristics, but there's some common characteristics, and the job of a positivist is to identify what those common characteristics are. Similar to if I go back to heart disease, it's not like, we can create, the list of 15, let's say, factors that are related to heart disease. It's not like everyone embodies all 15 of those different variables, but there's a pattern going on there that's most of those variables tend to be found in individuals who experiencing heart disease. Certain objective characteristics are patterned across individuals. So these characteristics, they're patterned. So it's no longer just about the individual, but these are common characteristics. There's a pattern that we can identify that, let's say, with 75% likelihood, an individual commits violent crime, has also been a victim of crime at some point, of violent crime at some point in their own life. So we could look at the correlations, and we're looking at relationships. The idea here is that deviance is an essential characteristic. It's a distinct part of a person, that there's that idea that there's something different between the deviant and the non-deviant, or the criminal and the non-criminal. We could also look at the macro level and think about society, institutions, and structures and how they may influence crime rates. And we talk about in a few weeks or next week, talk about the social ecological approach, social disorganization theory. In this case, looking at how is the community structured? What kind of resources are available in the community? Are people to what degree are they integrated into the community and feel a sense of belonging and connection to the community? These are all variables at a very macro level, institution, community-wide structure, that we could look at the influence of criminality or deviance. A strong indicator of crime and criminality in a community is degree of economic inequality and degree of poverty within a community and economic opportunity. So these are variables, these are common characteristics that are shared among communities which experience relatively high rates of violent crime. But there's something going on there at the economic level that we can identify as an influence, very macro level. So examples, from a positivist viewpoint, we look at fentanyl, drug overdose. We're just measuring things, right? Overdose rates have increased 3 times between 1999 and 2017. That's a significant increase in overdose rates. Of all the overdose rates, or all the overdoses in the United States, the largest contributor to overdoses is from fentanyl. And then, you can try to measure people's exposure. When do they get first exposed to fentanyl? How do they gain access? What's their network, social networks? What about, gathering information about previous history with alcohol, other drugs and substances? We can look at demographic factors. Males more likely to engage with fentanyl use. We could look at racial demographic differences. We could look at employment level, geographic location in terms of residence, non-rural versus rural, affluent, poverty, measure, looking for demographics. Constructionism is a little bit, whoops, we gotta go back. I think I'm gonna go back here, hold on. And that, I think I lost my share screen. There we go. All right. Now, one more time. Sorry about that. Let's see. This one here. Okay, there we go. So in this case, I'm looking at constructionism, kind of a different viewpoint. Constructionist has a focus or a belief that nothing is inherently deviant, nothing is deviant or criminal just because of how bad it is for society. So I'll give you an example, like drinking and driving was not really criminally sanctioned, I mean, until the 1980s, or I just say it's really lax in terms of regulations and criminalization of drinking and driving or driving under the influence. So some particular events happened in the 1980s that facilitated that. So it wasn't that all of a sudden, the drinking and driving rates and accidents started to increase in the 1980s. It had been relatively flat. But then during that particular environment, that time period started to become defined as a particular social problem and issue needed to be addressed. So nothing is deviant just because it's harmful. Child abuse has been going on for a long time, but it was never criminalized until the 1800s. So it wasn't like all of a sudden child abuse started happening and it was criminalized, but rather it's a difference in terms of meaning. So for constructionists, focus on the process of something becoming defined as being deviant or criminal. So how does it become defined as being deviant or criminal? How does same-sex relations, how does being gay, how does being lesbian, how does being transgender, how does that become defined as being deviant? That's going to get us into history and culture, social forces, probably power and inequality. It could also be focused on how does something no longer become defined as being deviant or criminal? So marijuana becomes a good example of that. It's no longer viewed as deviant or criminal for the most part. I mean, in states where it's recreational marijuana is legal and accessible, it's no longer criminal for sure. So how does that happen? Like this process of becoming or not becoming deviant. Focus on studying definitions of deviance or crime. The idea is that you only can understand deviance by understanding the historical, cultural context of something. Attempt to understand sometimes the viewpoint of the deviant, like how do individuals who get labeled as being deviant or criminal, how do they understand that stigma and that label? There's also a viewpoint from a constructionist, doesn't assume that the positivist approach provide an adequate view or that they provide the best view or the only view of which to study and look at deviance and criminality. Oftentimes, this isn't always true. That's why I put kind of. Focuses more on what we call soft deviance, things like tattooing, marijuana use. I mean, things that are not like violent crime and things like that. That's a general idea. So different examples. I mentioned this before. Curious History of Sex is really fascinating. It's about history and culture, different definitions and explanations of sexuality, gender differences, all kinds of different things that you can kind of look at in terms of how humans have attached meaning towards sexual behavior and how that's changed across time and place and impacted by race and gender. This is a pretty powerful book I remember reading years ago about social construction of Native American criminality, how, constructing ideas about criminality among particular populations. The War on Drugs, Dan Baum's book, pretty powerful book, pretty easy. He's a journalist, pretty easy to get into if you're ever interested in a book on the War on Drugs of the 1980s. It's pretty eye-opening. Janice Irvine, Disorders of Desire, so creating disorders, constructing ideas, sexuality and gender in America, and in sexology, a new branch of study. And then Thomas Szasz, this sort of idea about mental illness, that mental illness is a myth, He's questioning the constructions that's coming out of the field of psychiatry, the meanings that are coming out of that particular space. And he wants to deconstruct ideas that were commonly accepted about mental health. So both approaches are valuable. They have benefits, they have limitations. I think it's important to come at it, things, look at it from both angles, multiple angles. I think some people like to favor maybe one versus the other. I see the value in both. I tend to be more interested in the constructionist approach because I'm interested in history and culture and that process of becoming deviant or not, or how meanings change across time and place and the impact of meanings, just my interest. But I don't deny the influence or the value of the positivist approach. I think it's important to engage in both. Okay, so two, we can look at responsive deviance. So we can't adequately separate out the deviant from the non-deviant. For example, most crimes, there's more crimes that are committed than people are arrested or charged for a crime. I mean, by huge amounts. It's only a small fraction of people get arrested and get arrested for a criminal act. I mean, there's much more going on than is going on in terms of arrest. And we can't adequately separate out like who's deviant and who's not deviant, or what is and what is not deviant. Deviance is not a quality of the act a person commits, but rather a consequence of the application of rules to somebody else. So smoking was not deviant for a long period of time until smoking became deviant once the application of rules and sanctions by another group or individuals. So it requires that process. For deviance to occur, there must be a response from the audience. So the audience must be defining something as being deviant for deviance to start to be able to happen. There has to be a response and a reaction. So when smoking became viewed as no longer acceptable, violation of social norms, and became viewed critically, then there became a reaction, and that reaction is part of labeling, defining something as being bad. Now, all of a sudden, labeling people who engage in that as being bad. Like that's one way to think about the process of deviance. Focus on looking at the responses encourages us to move away from thinking about the individual, and now we're going to think about the audience, whether that's community or society. So rather than looking at, for example, the smoker and thinking about, well, why do individuals smoke? What are, from a positivist viewpoint, trying to establish all the variables that influence the likelihood of smoking. Here we're moving to, okay, what are the meanings of smoking? How they changed across time? What are the sanctions that are being applied to people who smoke? And like looking at that audience level. Social control theory is part of this, right? It's about social control is regulating human behavior. So it's about regulation, like we talked about last week with social control and how it's changed over time. So real quick summary, like Tony's and Durkheim, right? From pre-modern to modern, moved from like a lot of informal social control, family, community, just informal. We didn't have a lot of, there weren't institutions of control prior to modernity, or there weren't a lot of institutions of control. There were some important ones for sure, religious institutions being one of them. But then we fast forward to modern day modernity, and then we get these sort of institutions that are built upon different principles and ideas, and we get more formalized or an extension of more formal mechanisms of social control. So Michel Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish, highly encouraged to read it. It's a fascinating book exploring pre and post modernity and the rise and the birth of the prisons. I won't talk about Goffman, no reason to talk about that. But these are like the rise of formal institutions. We still have informal social control for sure. Say most people are guided by, I think everybody's influenced by informal social control. And in a lot of circumstances, if not most circumstances, it's the informal social control that's more powerful than the formal. That we choose to do something or not to do something, not because it may be against the law and we're worried about the criminal sanctions, but we're maybe more worried about losing our social standing, or that we're doing things that go against what the wishes of our loved ones and people we're connected to, what they want or what they believe we should be doing. And then there's ideological social control, which is controlling the way people think and believe about things. So if you control one way if controlling a population is influencing controlling of their beliefs about things. So Gramsci is the one who comes up with this idea of hegemony, domination by consent. Sometimes we believe things that go against our own interest. Johann Hari's book Lost Connections kind of gets at this a little bit, where he talks a lot about that depression, anxiety in modern day life is coming, that's influenced significantly by the kind of work that's available for us, the kind of work that we do, the way our communities are structured. It's like it's the human's experience of depression and anxiety is a normal response to a lot of challenges and a lot of issues going on in the structure of society itself. If we tell the story, the ideological social control, if we tell the story, we provide the belief, or the belief is being provided that people who experience depression and anxiety, it's like their own fault, or it's their own making, or they, like we put it on the individual. We're removing from our view the structure of society itself. And by doing that, that's representing interest. By not leaving the structure of society alone and saying, okay, we're just going to keep the structure the way it is, the economy the way that it is. Meanwhile, people are experiencing depression and anxiety at higher rates. Well, people's interests are being served by keeping the institutions the way that they run and operate versus shaping institutions to be more humane and to support humanity in more significant ways. So I don't know, Kai Erickson's book, Wayward Puritans, good example, where he applies all this to this idea about the audience to Salem, Massachusetts in the 1600s and then the witch trials. So his application is like this functionalism, structural functionalism, and application to deviance and criminality. And from a functionalist viewpoint, audience members society needs to have deviance and crime for it to function, because what it does by defining something as being deviant or criminal, it brings people together to defend norms and values, to clarify norms and values, and it increases people's awareness of a sense of bonding and connection to a common community. So deviance has a lot of functions. It clarifies collective values and ideals. Black Lives Matter, movement and protests that were going on in cities throughout the United States a few years back. A lot of that, and then identifying whether or not, are those protests, well, when protests turn to vandalism, like where do we mark the line between what was acceptable protest and what was not? We're clarifying as a collective, as a nation, what our values are regarding racial inequities, what our values are, the freedom to protest, the right to be able to protest, and different kind of elements. We're trying to clarify what our values are, and our values being represented in our institutions. Also, we're reinforcing where we draw that boundary between what's acceptable and what is not. When somebody, when that moral boundary between acceptability. Oftentimes, deviance can also bring people together, fighting against a common enemy. And by identifying deviance, it makes these functions possible. So continuing on this theme, that we can't separate out the deviant from the audience. We got to be thinking about there's a relationship going on between the two, that a person may engage in a particular behavior that we identify today as being criminal or deviant, but that's because of the audience is defined it that way. So we have to look at the relationship between the two. Sometimes it depends on if something is deviant or criminal, on the temper of the audience. So what's going on with the audience, with people, with community at that particular moment in time, historically or culturally? It depends on that. Smoking tobacco changed meaning over time. If I go back to like the early 1900s, for women to smoke tobacco was taboo. It was not viewed as acceptable. It was the feminist movement in the 1910s and 1920s that changed that. Virginia Slims is a cigarette company. There became a marketing campaign of cigarettes were identified as torches of freedom, as a way of selling cigarettes to women around the sort of umbrella of a feminist movement idea. Some meanings were changing. So the temper of the audience is the focus here. So what is deviance? Depends on what people consider it to be so. It's not something that's inherent in the property of the individual. You have to know the audience, two different people, different statuses, let's say based on race, age, class, There may be a different reaction by the audience based on who's committing that particular thing. That gives us insight into what's going on within the community itself. One thing to think about is deviance and conformity are mirror reflections of each other. So if an audience values private property, now we're going to get into an issue of like vagrancy laws, loitering, and things like that, that there's a relationship between what an audience values and what it's deeming deviant or criminal. Okay, now I'm going to walk through, just maybe try to be fast about this, about a different historical perspective on wars on drugs in the United States. Some of this I'll be going through really quick, and I'm not providing a lot of detail in each one of these, but the point here is to give you an example and illustration about how meanings about alcohol and drug use have changed over time, and some common variables or common things that are going on that were going on during these time periods when wars on drugs were being declared. The first drug law in the United States, or law against a particular substance, was against opium in 1875 in San Francisco. Opium was a substance used by Chinese laborers, by members of the Chinese immigrants. And up until that time period, they were largely available to the general public. It wasn't demonized, wasn't criminalized. But then an issue started to develop where got the transnational railroad was built, completed in 1869. So a lot of Chinese laborers worked on the railroad from the west going east, where they met in Promontory Point, Utah. After the completion of railroad, a lot of Chinese laborers are looking for work. Now they're competing against white laborers for work. There's an economic recession, putting more strain on the dominant group, the whites. Within society, there became organizations that are trying to defend the rights of defending white workers. So the Working Man's Party. There became sort of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the fear of the Chinese, xenophobia, fear of the Chinese, the fear that the Chinese were going to take over America. Americans were like idle, sitting outside, and the Chinese very industrious, kind of a fear that this becomes a moral panic that we'll be talking about. It's also that Henry talks about. So there became a sort of response to opioid use, a fear that Chinese laborers were preying on white women and that they're committing violent crime, and they're basically creating a lot of problems for society. And then there became these violent reactions, violence committed against members, against Chinese in different communities, including Tacoma, Washington. So a famous story about Washington State and a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. Fast forward into early 1910s, time period of the great migration of African Americans out of the South, going north to work in war industries, working just to leave the South, and the segregation of the South and move north for different economic opportunities. And okay, so there's a migration of people. Now all of a sudden we get an environment where blacks and whites are interacting more and more. There's the mass movement of people out of the South, the blacks out of the South moving north. It's a lot of social change going on. There's a civil rights movement going on at this particular time as well. So there's a support of the Black voice and understand the Black experience this particular time period. And there became a fear that and this idea that Black men were using cocaine and they were resulting in violent behavior. And there was a concern for the safety and security of people in communities, and safety and security of white women in particular. It's also a time period of a jazz subculture, a lot of fear around jazz and marijuana smoking in these clubs, and kind of fear about this particular substance and idea. So the Harrison Narcotics Act. And then in 1919, the temperance and prohibition. Like, how do you explain how we went to prohibition? There was a viewpoint that alcohol was the reason for poverty. Alcohol was the reason for a significant contributor to crime. There became moral entrepreneurs of native-born Protestant middle-class white women who were the crusaders, advocating for prohibition. There's a lot of anomie, a lot of change going on at that time period. Immigration, Irish Catholics, predominantly Catholic, who were immigrating to the United States, get like a religious culture conflict in the United States, a lot of working class conflict. There's a lot of stuff that's going on, and alcohol becomes identified as the source of these problems of crime and deviance. You can see where this is leading to like a constructed idea, right? So things were being constructed um, about drug use, consumption. Maybe sometimes it's particular populations like the Chinese or African Americans, or sometimes it's, it's like what's going on in the broader context. We need to understand the temper of the audience and what's going on in culture and society around us to be able to understand why something might be deviant or criminal. Then you get the Mexican Revolution of 1910. After the Mexican Revolution, there's immigration in the United States from Mexico, a lot of scapegoating, a lot of problems get put on, like say the scapegoats are, there's a source of a problem, but groups that don't have a lot of political social power get identified as the source of the problem, so they get scapegoated on. So there's an economic depression starts in the 1929, the Great Depression, a lot of economic struggles. Then there became this connection, and it's the Mexican laborers could become the scapegoat, and not only Mexican Americans, but also African Americans, and things like marijuana consumption gets linked to sex crimes, insanity, violent behavior. That eventually leads to 1930, and the Federal Narcotics Bureau was created, the first federal institution or body that's there to regulate or address drugs. Henry Anslinger was the commissioner, the first commissioner, and he was the commissioner until 1962. There's things like the Marijuana Stamp Tax Act, which led to the decriminalization of what was called killer weed. Anslinger was a moral entrepreneur. He's out there trying to build the organization and support the organization of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He's evoking fear and hysteria, engaging in facilitating moral panics. 1950s, we established there's mandatory minimums the first time. It starts to raise the question, like, why are we doing mandatory minimums at this particular moment in time? 1960s, the counterculture and marijuana use moves to the middle class. And it's also during that time period when marijuana use starts to move to the middle class more, that there becomes states that start to decriminalize marijuana, and because they start to see that it's against their political interest. The middle class, if the middle class are using, there's a problem that there's going to be it's no longer acceptable that the middle class is going to be incarcerated for smoking and possessing marijuana. So law started to change, and Oregon was the first state to decriminalize in the 1970s. There's a lot of research going on about not only marijuana, but other drugs at that time. President Nixon put together a commission to look at all kinds of drugs, and they started to realize that there's a lot of falsehoods about claims and beliefs and ideas that people had about drugs. And so the big time period of like Zimberg study, you don't need to know the study, and I won't go into it here, but that just a lot of studies were going on that were debunking a lot of the myths about drugs and criminality and drugs and violent crime and all these different kind of things. Late 1970s is when we start to get into the contemporary war on drugs. Crack cocaine, powder cocaine. The cocaine use starts to go from, powder cocaine's middle class, upper middle class, elite. Crack cocaine becomes it's a processing of powder cocaine to a different form, to a rock, to a crystal form, gets used in different ways. And it's cheaper to buy and form, can be sold in smaller quantities, and it creates a lot of challenges and problems in a lot of inner cities. And that becomes one of the reasons for the war on drugs that Republicans and Democrats over the years engaged in and escalated the war on drugs. So a lot of things like the war on drugs, I don't know, like we could look at things that, let me go back, that sometimes there's a kernel of truth. There's a little bit of truth, maybe like an incident happens regarding, let's say, crack and violent crime. Like there's a kernel of truth, but the media magnifies them. Politicians and others magnify things. They misconstrue things. They distort things in particular ways. There's a historical context around drug wars, economic, social, cultural, racial things that are going on that we need to address. Oftentimes a group is gets scapegoated, viewed as being the dangerous group, and they become the scapegoat for larger social problems. And then finally, let's look at how we can tie this to the audience response. So if we look at drug use and drug-related problems, like we in the United States, historically, until recently with the opioid crisis, have viewed these things as crime problems versus public health. That's an issue of definition, an issue of construction. Like, why are we viewing these things as a crime problem versus a public health problem? Years ago, what's the name of I can't think of the policy, but like other countries in Western European countries have harm reduction policies. Like, how do we generate to reduce the harm of drugs to people and communities and society? How do we do that in different ways besides just criminalization and incarceration? And there's a lot of other models that are out there. So what's going on within culture and society that's influencing one definition or way of thinking about drug use versus another or possession? So from a functionalist viewpoint, it's a sense like, man, a rapid social change going on, industrialization, urbanization, mass immigration, economic contraction and struggle. So anomie, a lot of sense of normlessness, a lot of dramatic change, and people are looking for, the community's looking for a sense of security, understanding. So things like prohibition or anti-marijuana or whatever the drug war was, it's about the temper of the audience of having fear and concern about crime and things that are going on in the community, and they view alcohol as being the source of poverty and crime and delinquency. So it gives them a sort of a sense that brings them together to clarify what their values are, what they want out of people in society. They're rallying for a particular law or a particular way of addressing social problems, and through that, they're clarifying what their values, morals, and beliefs are. Conflict theory is going to get us to looking at inequalities, that how things are being defined or represented by interests. So Anslinger, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, they're trying to grow that organization. And so moving towards criminalization, demonization, and incarceration fits their particular model as a moral entrepreneur. And as a business model, they're trying to grow their business. Politicians may be trying to, Clinton, who was a Democrat in the 1990s, President Clinton, escalated the war on drugs in ways that were far beyond what Republicans did before that. And that was for political advantage and gain. So sometimes with conflict theory, that, this idea that groups get scapegoated. So Mexican Americans, African Americans, Chinese laborers get scapegoated as source of a problem, which is a reflection of white supremacy and racism in society itself. I'll give you an example, like maybe before, about 1970s, 1980s in places like Chicago and Baltimore and St. Louis and a lot of cities around the United States, that they lost a lot of jobs in manufacturing. And then in that environment, inequality or poverty rates go up, jobs disappear, unemployment goes up. And rather than working in these communities to help facilitate economic development, move towards a model of incarceration and criminalization. And those are choices. Those are based on constructions and ideas. So the benefit of looking at audience responses is we get to study culture, society, the temper of the audience, and we're not just looking at like the motivations, the rationale, like with the variables, like what's influencing people to do what they do, but we're also thinking about, well, why are things being defined in a particular way? Who's defining things in particular ways? And how do we kind of get into that space? So that's kind of the idea. There's some films here I put together or some references. The film 13th, about the 13th Amendment, really powerful film of looking at the role of the criminal justice system and its impact on the Black community, specifically over a historical time period, over U.S. history. The film Grass, narrated by Woody Harrelson, is a really fun, interesting, just sort of story about constructing ideas about marijuana over time. Smoke and Mirrors, The War on Drugs, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander, a really powerful book. And then Chasing the Scream. If you're interested in a book on the war on drugs, 1980s and 1990s on, Joe Anhari's book is fabulous. He's a journalist. He's a great storyteller. It's really accessible in terms of being able to read. And I think you might appreciate that and like that. Okay, that's it for today. Man, I hope things go well for you. Have a wonderful, fabulous week. Appreciate all that you do. Have a great day and catch you next time.